Good morning. Dr. Terry is a genuine expert in the addiction field. So we welcome here to talk about the problem of alcoholism, disease, or bad habit. Terry?
There are so many angles that we could approach addictions or alcohol and drug problems this morning, and I just want to thank you, for coming to hear about this. And with all the different angles we could take, I decided to go with alcohol problems and trying to tease out this issue of addiction versus over-drinking, because it's very confusing for many of us. And I have several goals for this morning's talk. And the first is to better understand why alcoholism is called a disease. I think that doesn't make sense for a lot of people, because we know that you have to have volition to pick up that drink, and you have to have a decision to put the drink down. So where does disease fit into those choices? And to be able to differentiate patterns of drinking. What is normal drinking, and when does it become problem drinking? Because that's a challenge for the person with a drinking problem to figure out too, because they're generally convinced that they're completely normal drinkers. Third, I'd like to touch on how we as a faith community might respond to those who struggle with alcohol problems, and we can come back to that in the questions. I want to give a message of hope, so I hope that you walk away believing that this is a problem that can be treated and that people can go on to do very well, even those who develop severe alcohol problems. And I hope to move through this at a speed so that we have time for your questions, because you may have concerns about the subject. I'm not going to touch on them at all. So please feel free to talk about different angles of addiction beyond alcohol, or some of the so-called behavioral addictions, such as gambling, when we're done in the question and answer. And I'd like to begin by asking, how many of you have been close to somebody who has a problem with drinking? Family member, friend? I'm guessing it doesn't leave out too many of us in the room. I mean, the problems are everywhere. They're next door, they're in the house. And we have mixed feelings about these people. And we need to acknowledge that. We love them and worry about them. We want to help them, but they tend to be extremely frustrating. They generally don't see the problem that everyone else sees. I often refer to this with patients, that for the family members, I tell them it's like they have blinders on, like the horse with blinders, and they're looking straight ahead, and they don't see peripherally what everybody else can see that just seems so apparent and obvious. They repeatedly intend to stop drinking tomorrow, and they'll say that they'll at least cut back. But those promises over and over don't tend to take place. And we ask, is there any hope for them? I'm just hitting my head against the wall. Is this really going to go anywhere productive? And I want to show today where drinking problems lead for most people. We ask, should they be pitied? Should they be punished? There's a lot of punishment going on in our legal system for people that overdrink, particularly those who overdrink and drive. Or should they be loved and supported? Some sort of combination of that mix. Well, I'd like to begin telling a few stories about how these problems can play out. And I want to say that everything I say about patients is either from the public record or is told in such a way that it won't identify whom I'm talking about. One very interesting personality that you probably heard about a few years ago at Mayo is former Congressman Patrick Kennedy. He's a Mayo patient, and I can talk about him because he's talked publicly about coming to Mayo for treatment. Nothing I say will be related in any way to anyone's treatment of him. But this was a man at the height of family and political power. He was a Kennedy. He was a longtime senior congressman from Rhode Island. He was a spokesman for mental health and addiction recovery. I recall listening to the news one day as I was driving down Highway 52. It was May 4th, 2006, and I'd just given a lecture on the denial and rationalization involved in addiction treatment. And when I flipped on NPR, the broadcaster stated that Congressman Kennedy had driven his car into a barricade on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. at 2:45. He told law enforcement that he was late for a vote. The report reads, as described in Wikipedia, a United States Capitol Police official said the congressman had appeared intoxicated when he crashed his car. It was also noted by media that the last vote of the night had occurred 6 hours earlier. Later that day, Kennedy admitted that he had an addiction to prescription medication, and he announced he would be readmitting himself to a drug rehabilitation facility at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, where he had sought prior treatments for addictions. So what is his problem? Bad character, bad habit, or a bad disease? Your political affiliation might determine in part how you view that. But those who follow the Kennedys through the years are aware of his mother, Joan. Late Senator Kennedy's first wife has battled alcoholism for years. Wikipedia includes this tragic description in her biography. Quote, her later years have been shaped by chronic alcoholism, which had appeared during her marriage. It escalated with sporadic, uneven sobriety, repeated drunk driving arrests, court-ordered rehabilitations, and return to drinking. This ultimately led to kidney damage with the possibility of dialysis and protracted complications. And how's this ended for Patrick? Well, after his father's death, he did not run for re-election to Congress in 2010 after a series of terms. Since that time, he is married, he's had 2 children, and has continued national advocacy for parity in mental health and addiction treatment. On March 7, 2008, he spoke to the City Club of Cleveland. Kennedy acknowledged having bipolar disorder and being a recovering alcoholic. He is co-founder of the organization One Mind for Research, which seeks to increase resources and efficiency in brain disorders. So there's a story of tragedy in his mother and of real hope in where his life is at now and how he's moved on in his serving and how he's remaining in recovery. I want to share one other story about another patient. A young, divorced mother entered our addiction treatment program. Like so many, she knew there was a problem but minimized its significance in her life. She was shameful to think of herself as alcoholic and the possibility that her drinking had hurt her children, her work performance, and her former marriage. And this kind of shame can be so common in women that battle alcohol problems and really impede them getting help for that problem. She completed her 1 month of residential treatment and was sent out with the usual recommendations, do your aftercare program and get to AA. But she returned to treatment in relapse within a year, more shameful, depressed, and discouraged. Several months later, I was at home reading the Evening Post Bulletin and read about her in the paper, in the obituaries. It didn't give her cause of death, though I strongly suspect alcohol poisoning or suicide when intoxicated. This disease can kill people. So what do we know about drinking from Scripture and from science? I want to touch very briefly on the Scripture, try to go into a little bit of the science. Does anyone recall Jesus' first miracle? Pastors can't answer.
Water to wine.
Oh, wow, this is a well-studied group. You know the Bible. At the wedding at Cana and turning water to wine. Wine is the vehicle of Jesus' first public disclosure of divinity through this miracle. And repeatedly, the Old Testament refers to the fruit of the vine as a gift of God. In 1 Timothy 5:23, Paul encourages Timothy to take a little wine to improve his health. It's almost a rebuke. Stop drinking only water and use a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses. It makes it difficult to argue for strict teetotaling, doesn't it? So how do we square that with the writer of Proverbs? Proverbs 2:1, wine is a mocker and beer a brawler. Whoever is led astray by them is not wise. Or Proverbs 23, who has woe, who has sorrow? Those who linger over wine. You will be like one sleeping on the high seas, lying on top of the rigging, When will I wake up so I can find another drink? That is the experience of people that just get caught in this cycle, that when they don't drink, they don't feel normal, they start shaking, they feel miserable, they need to find that drink so that they can feel normal again. How has modern science teased out this paradox? I would argue that the paradox persists, though we better understand the nature of the problem. Modern versions of the paradox include admonitions to drink wine for your heart health, ubiquitous consumption of wines and microbrews to enhance good food. And we've all become foodies. You have to match your wine with the right choice of dinner, the microbrew that goes best with the food. And alcohol's become a social lubricant that's just widely accepted. We contrast this with college students dying of alcohol poisoning after binge drinking. Reports like Columbia University students were up to 50% binge drink during their freshman year. And the cost of medical care for the trauma, for the heart, liver, and other organ disease, not to mention highway fatalities from drunk driving. Alcohol-related illnesses account for 15% of our national healthcare budget. And if you put in other addictions, 25% of the national healthcare budget is spent on alcohol and drug problems. These are the medical problems primarily, not addiction treatment. Now, the estimated cost to society is $300 billion a year. Whenever I look at these numbers, it just staggers me. That would buy a lot of schools and do a lot of road repair. $300 billion. So what this is costing us is huge. So big question for all of us is, how much is too much? When does this become too much alcohol? And I want to go a little bit into the epidemiology of alcohol problems. What it looks like when we take a look at the whole country. If this line represents everybody in the United States, what surprises many people is that a third of the people, about 30%, do not touch alcohol. They don't drink at all. They're not all Baptist and Mormons. Many people choose not to drink. They don't like the taste. It mixes with their medications. It just makes them feel lightheaded, makes them feel odd. And so they choose not to drink. The vast majority of people, about 50%, fall into what we would call social drinkers. But what's impressive is that the majority of social drinkers have less than 12 drinks a year. So many people who describe themselves as social drinkers is that glass of milk and David at Christmas, is the occasional glass of wine. I'll try a few sips of that homemade beer, but they're not drinking in any kind of problem way. I haven't divided this up particularly evenly, but there's a group here that's about 5%, and they're called at-risk drinkers. They don't have problems, but they're drinking enough that they could develop a problem. And I'll go into that a little bit more of what that looks like. And then there's this category that's about another 5% of people who abuse alcohol. They're not addicted to it. They could stop, but they repeatedly have problems in their life and they keep doing it anyway. Maybe somebody who's not addicted, who's being picked up for their second DUI. They're not stopping that pattern of going out, having something to drink, and driving home. They could shift. They could reverse the car here and go back and not have a drinking problem. And then this final category, which is about 10% of the population, are people that have become addicted or alcoholic. And for those people, when they drink, you can't predict what's going to happen. That repeatedly they lose control. These are the people who meet the medical criteria of what it is to have an alcohol problem. Now, what is the likelihood of becoming one of this category? And I'm going to explain a little more about what at risk is. Basically, what is normal drinking? The World Health Organization, as well as the National Institute of Health, have figured out, in looking at how people drink, when people start having problems with drinking and when the amount of alcohol they drink begins to damage their organs. This is different between men and women, really based on body water content. In that sense, we are not created equal. We have different body water, and that significantly affects how we metabolize alcohol and when we're likely to have alcohol problems. And where we're seeing this as an issue in medicine is that women who are going out after work, bellying up to the bar and drinking right along with the boys, if they go drink for drink, that woman is going to end up having significantly more problems related to the drinking because it's less body water content, it's different how it affects her liver. I see people at the transplant center, women who really were not drinking in what we consider significantly high doses, but they go into liver failure because of their prolonged drinking. For men, what's recommended is no more than 4 standard drinks in a day. That's a 12-ounce beer, size of glass of wine you get in a restaurant, which is 4 to 5 ounces of wine, or standard bar drink, which has 1 shot of alcohol in it, which is 1.5 ounces, and no more than 14 in a week. For women, it's no more than 3 in a day and no more than 7 in a week. For people who stay within their limits, they're very unlikely to run into problems. If people stay within these limits, their odds of going on to have a drinking problem or alcoholism, 1 in 100. If people stick with no more than these high numbers per week, but they go over the recommended daily amounts. So here we're talking about the college binge drinkers who maybe drink 1 night a week, but it's a big night. They are at significantly greater risk. Make sure I get the number right here. It's 1 in 5. So they're really bumping up their chances of going on to lose control and have a problem. If people are breaking both of the rules on a regular basis, their odds of going on to have a drinking problem is about 50%, about 1 in 2. So when I'm meeting with people and coaching about where their drinking should be, I talk about these limits. Somebody might not have any problems related to their drinking, but for the man coming home after work, having 2 glasses of wine, maybe it started with 1, maybe it wasn't every night, but then it creeps up to 2. Then they retire, move to Arizona, happy hour starts a little earlier. 2 can easily become 3, and if they start at 3 in the afternoon, it could be 4 to 5. You can see how this creep occurs. So, what can be within the daily 4 can easily begin to exceed these weekly amounts and can become 20, 25 in a week. And that's a lot of exposure to the brain with this alcohol. And that's when people can begin to lose control over how much they're drinking. And that's one of the major symptoms of alcoholism, is that once they get started, they basically lose count and just keep going. You can't predict if they're going to stop at 2 or if it's going to become 8 before they stop, or however many.